Warning: suicide and death. This content addresses mental health issues, including research and narratives on suicide. Please take care while engaging with it and only proceed if you feel safe doing so. If you or someone you love is having thoughts of suicide, please contact 988. Help is available. Welcome. This is your host, Lisa Meeks. Over the last 3 years, I've had the immense blessing of getting to know John and Jennifer Ruddell. Together, we've worked to produce a special series on medical training and suicide. Our series is dedicated to the memory of Jack Ruddell and to the memory of all medical trainees lost to suicide. His parents, John and Jennifer, and our entire team hope this series sparks new conversations and accelerates policies and practices in medical training that improve learner engagement in help seeking and reduce the drivers that contribute to the erosion of medical trainee well-being. If this is your first introduction to the series, please stop and return to episode 102, where our series and this story begin. There are important contextual items that help our listeners and readers fully appreciate the scope of the issue. Importantly, this is where the story of Jack Ruddell is introduced. We are grateful to this audience for engaging in this series, and we encourage you to share it broadly. We are also deeply grateful for and indebted to the Ruddell family. Their strength in sharing their son's story is a gift to us all. Throughout these series, they've given us important reminders about where we need to focus, how we need to care for one another, and the need for cultural change. We'll begin with an introduction by our consult psychiatrist and narrator, Dr. Joseph Murray.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Joe Murray, a psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College and a consultant for this series. Before we begin, I want to welcome you to the final episode in our 6-part series. For those who've been with us since the beginning, we appreciate your attention to this important topic. If you are new, we'd like to disclose that this episode covers sensitive topics, including suicide and suicidal ideation. The content may be distressing for some listeners, so please proceed with caution. If at any point you feel overwhelmed, it's okay to pause and come back when you're ready. We understand that many people are struggling. If you are struggling with your mental health or having thoughts of suicide, know that help is available. You can call or text 988 to reach the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, where trained professionals are ready to support you. Remember, it's okay to ask for help. You are not alone. In this episode, Dr. Meeks and the Ruddells discuss the profound impact of sharing one's story. The Ruddells discuss their journey of healing and the power of their voices and their writing. They reflect on the challenges and rewards of participating in this podcast series, sharing their insights on the importance of acknowledging the significance of every life, even in the face of tragedy. As they navigate their grief, they find strength in each other and in creating this series, along with a renewed commitment to advocating for mental health awareness and improvements in medical education. Remember, today's episode is a reflection, a look back at the last 3 years building this series. For the full scope of the issue and to hear from the many experts that contributed to this series, it's important to return to episode 102 and start from the beginning.
John and Jennifer, in what ways has participating in this series contributed to your healing process?
Through this opportunity to share our story and Jack's story, we spent a lot of time reflecting. And now that it's been 4 years, we've developed some insights and a greater understanding that suicide is a very powerful and very painful subject and is still highly stigmatized. It's helped in our healing, And I hope after listening to our podcast series that you as listeners feel as I always have, or as we have, that our Jack, his life mattered. And he is still making an impact, a positive one, on medical education and on learners.
Perhaps the most important part of the healing process for us is sharing about Jack. As Jennifer said, we've been adamant in our thinking that Jack's life mattered. And just very simply, we did not get acknowledgement of that from Jack's school after we lost Jack. And as we spoke about earlier in the sessions, over the course of the following 2 years, we didn't hear a thing. And it became very frustrating, angering. And so I think, as we mentioned, we took the opportunity to go back to the school and talk to them and make the point that Jack's life did matter. And I think they agreed. Further, we worked with them to try and make some changes, but it began to feel pretty futile. And so by being able to have this platform and to share why Jack's life mattered, it's just been so helpful. And as Jennifer said also, there's so much stigma and darkness around suicide. And from the beginning, we have been adamant that we will not let stigma or darkness or questions surround Jack's life or the end of his life, because he didn't deserve that. And to the extent that we can share, and I believe we have, what really is involved in suicide and what was going on that Jack was dealing with, I think that really helps ensure that Jack's life was bright, and even in its ending, there's meaning. So I think it's absolutely been healing for us.
Oh, it's been a while since we've talked, and I did not expect to feel so overwhelmed again so quickly. It does take us all, I mean, it's hard to talk about it. It does take us all back. We've spent a lot of time together. When I first met you, you were only a year out from Jack's loss. And so in many ways, I feel like I've had the absolute honor and privilege of kind of watching you progress in your healing. And you've always amazed me. You're both so incredibly strong. What struck me in our first conversation was your absolute resolve to not let Jack be dishonored in the way that he passed, and your commitment to destigmatizing death by suicide. I continue to just be in awe of you both. Jack touched so many lives. To hear each person that we interviewed and to be able to watch videos of Jack and read Jack's writing, and he's just an amazing individual. And I feel blessed to be able to have worked with you to raise this issue, to tell his story, the fullness of the story, and to elevate this issue in medical education. It's a tough conversation, but one that needs to be had. And so you coming forward and sharing Jack's story is critically important. I wonder if in this process you have felt more empowered by being able to tell the story, or did it feel like an additional burden? And maybe it felt like both at different times.
I think it did for me. One of the frustrations that we had, that I had, and that I'm sure others who are in our situation have had, is that when it comes to a death by suicide, when it comes to mental health issues, it is so hard to have an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation. These are things that people just generally don't know, who aren't familiar. And when we have an opportunity to have these discussions, I think it's just by necessity, it's kind of uncomfortable. There's limited time, and so you have to sort of talk in sound bites. And that's so frustrating, because There are so many important lessons and messages. So having this, Lisa, has really allowed us to explore some of those things and to share them. And so it's been very empowering to get the input of experts and to do it in a way that does it justice.
Boy, yes. I agree. John did speak of our experience in participating in Docs with Disabilities in this wonderful podcast as being empowering. But on the other hand, there was a burden there. And the burden was to communicate this clearly and to call for change and to get it right. We truly wanted to advance the suicide prevention and advance the efforts in medical education. And the burden was to be open and honest and to normalize the discussion of this very complex health outcome.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Well, it is. From a different perspective, it's been a burden, of course, for us to talk about very raw experiences and about Jack's loss and to explore the conditions and talk about and keep these things top of mind as we've gone through this over the last 3 years. And so to sustain that, it has been a burden, but it's one that we've accepted because it's also helped us process. I think it's been really important. We've been able to understand a bit more as we try to interpret and we hear from others what other students are going through, what Jack was going through, and to try in our minds to balance his layers and to understand what those are. So I think it's helped us process in a way that gives us more clarity.
I appreciate so much your perspectives and your honesty and in kind of the balance and what it's felt like. And for our audience, I want to give them a little bit more context for this series and kind of how it evolved to get an understanding of how much of your heart and soul and time and energy you've put into this. We met and spent a year getting to know one another. And then I flew out to LA. We did in-person interviews twice where we sat the first time for 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours of talking about Jack's life, his experiences, what was happening. And that was, I believe, a year or two apart. And then in the interim, we interviewed so many experts. And of course, as co-producers of this series, you would listen to all of those interviews. Alongside Riley and Joe and all of our experts, we would craft the episodes. And when you think about what it takes to produce something, it's listening to episodes multiple times. I don't think that there was an episode that I didn't listen to probably 5 to 6 times as we were producing it, and then at least twice all the way through once it was done. And as you mentioned, that it keeps everything very real and very present all the time, and that can feel heavy. And I can't imagine going through this with anyone else. You are amazing partners in this effort. But I also don't understand how these stories are told without kind of letting yourself feel all of the emotions. So when we talk about the series, I think it's important for the average listener to understand the hundreds of hours that go into something like that and the research and the confirmation of the facts and making sure, Jennifer, as you said, making sure you're getting it right, leaning into those experts to make sure that we don't say or do something that would be harmful, that we present a very balanced approach, a very evidence-based approach, without losing the nuance of the way that this impacts individuals. So I'm in awe of what you've created, what we've created together, and I'm forever grateful for the time we've spent together.
We are forever grateful for you, honestly, truly. From our first conversation on the phone, so so long ago. It was a long time ago, but it feels like yesterday.
And also, you've let this unfold in a very tender way and a very respectful way. And I think we talked about one of the beautiful parts of Jack was his honesty and vulnerability. And as I think for us, this has required us to show vulnerability. And you and your colleagues and experts have done this in a very respectful way that's allowed us to sort of step into that bright light and share some very personal and hurtful things.
It has been a process. It's been a process to gradually integrate the loss of our Jack into our current life's narrative. But I think we've gained a lot of strength by speaking on this topic. When we first started, I was personally very fragile. I've always felt that mental well-being is a human right. And now it's a public health issue. And I don't believe that it was being treated that way at our son's medical school. It's not normal or safe to neglect your humanness. And it's important to be able to seek mental health support when it's needed. We've always advocated for that with our families. And it's important to be able to seek that without barriers and without stigma.
As I look back, think about where we started 3 years ago. Yes, we were very, very tender. We were very unsure. I remember coming into the first interview and how are we going to do this? And we were still in trauma. Sometimes we still are, but we were just very broken. And going through this journey, I think we've been able to sort of work through that, but also adopt a resolve and a level of confidence as we've gained an understanding of the issues and the drivers and in turn gained a clearer picture of what Jack was going through, not simply in medical education, but more broadly, the layers that we all have. So in contrast to where we were 3 years ago, we're deeply, deeply saddened and in grief, which is present every day. But we also feel that we've gained strength and we have a very important message, and that's simply increased over time.
In this next segment, the Ruddells discuss how writing became a deeply personal and transformative process. As you'll hear, their journey from private reflection to public advocacy led to the creation of an essay published in JAMA Internal Medicine. This piece is not just a tribute to Jack's life, but also a plea for systemic change, shining a light on the barriers and crises that exist in medical training today.
One of the ways that I process and kind of gather my thoughts and work through emotionally difficult things is to write, to journal, to write things down, to communicate things in writing. And the first time we met, Jennifer, you had taken pen to paper and had tried to work through some of your feelings in kind of a therapeutic way. And over the course of our time together, we kept coming back to this idea of sharing the story more broadly. Certainly, we're sharing it as part of the series. But as you have deepened in your resolve, you both came together to work on a piece that will be published in JAMA Internal Medicine. What was the driver for putting something out in writing?
Writing provides such a safe space to express and explore your thoughts and my complex emotions and kind of untangle it and have it make sense. You don't have to suppress anything when you're writing. But putting this article out was extremely meaningful to myself and to John, because it's a call for action. It's a call for change.
We spent so much time on this and so many different drafts and so many different thoughts. And I think that we wanted to share Jack's story, of course, which we've done. And perhaps more importantly, we wanted to very, very clearly call out the conditions in medical education.
And that's not everywhere.
No, it's not
just,
to paint everyone
right
with broad strokes, but I think that this clearly, as we have talked about in the various segments, is a crisis. And it's a crisis that has existed and yet has stalled. There is nothing going on. And for us, that is such a frustration. And so, in part, by writing this, I think that we're able to call out medical education institutions and really make a plea for change and do it in a very public way. Because when we say Jack's life mattered, sometimes we add to that Jack's death mattered. And there are lessons that he left us. And I think that's one way we've been able to impart.
I see this article as the most vulnerable of vulnerable acts, and it's almost a pleading to the medical education community, especially at the end, when you speak directly to the individual in the system. It's not just the system, it's all of us. And again, what's been meaningful and empowering and what's been burdensome, I can imagine this being one of those mixed things where you are putting something out there to the medical community and it will undoubtedly have a ripple effect and be viewed by many people who perhaps wouldn't naturally have been listening to this podcast either. So I do think it's one way to honor Jack's life and to plead to the medical education community to pay attention, to take very seriously the barriers that are in place. I personally know student affairs deans who would do anything and everything to help a learner. And in general, people want to be helpful and have tried to remove barriers, but there are still systems in place where learners are very, very afraid. So it's a difficult task. When you look back at Jack's experiences in medical school, do you feel like the subject of mental health or suicide prevention specifically was present?
Well, we've talked about the pairing, rightfully so, of discussion of mental health and suicide, because they are very important and they do go together. But I think it's also very important to us to help people understand that suicide is not simply mental health issues. And it's not something that can be characterized as simply burnout or pressures of school. And oftentimes, I think in the public dialogue, there are generalities of what suicide arises from. And those can be really a gross oversimplification. What we've come to realize is that suicide risk is much, much more complex. Many people with mental illnesses or mental disabilities who aren't at risk of suicide. And what's important that we've spoken of and that you've referred to, that I think is very descriptive, is this concept of layers that are unique to each individual.
Yes, yeah. The learners come into this environment with their own layers, with their life. And some of those layers can be very helpful to the learners in the medical field. The layers of perfectionism. Who wouldn't want their doctor to be perfect? But if you're a striver, that's one of your layers, that also needs a bit of attention. Because if you are achieving and overachieving to the detriment of yourself, then you may need to talk to someone because it's all cumulative and those layers, they add up. And then you gain more layers. And soon you are at your threshold.
And we've come to understand, and we always knew most of Jack's layers, and we talked about those during the different episodes. But we all have them. And I think it's important to recognize that these exist and that not only are they additive, and Lisa, you had a very good point here. You pointed out that in addition to just having a layer, say in terms of physical conditions, neurological conditions, learning disabilities, past relationships, toxic relationships, these things just blanket over you as a person. And you at one point said, it's not additive, but it's actually exponential. I absolutely believe that it's just not 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = 4, because every layer is just compounding the cumulative effect of all the others. And we saw that in Jack, and we've seen it in other medical students that we've talked to. And I just think that's very important for people to understand the complexity associated with suicide is not simply some of the generalities like mental health.
It's not the sum of the parts, is it? We've actually had some research papers come out that show the cumulative effects on burnout for learners with multiple disabilities. And then you start to add on other types of things. In this case, our research was looking at underrepresented learners that are coming in from minoritized backgrounds and the stressors there. But I think what's happening is that you have a threshold, right? We all have a threshold. And these things, as you say, start to layer on the learner, but then they enter a system where, as you said, perfection is one of the things that is coveted, if you will. And so they're entering a system where the goal is perfection, 100%. You are, in some cases, encouraged to compartmentalize your humanism, and you have all of these different things happening kind of in the background. And now, for the first time, because you're in this environment, particularly for people with disabilities, that includes a lot of systemic barriers and unique stressors, you find yourself almost in a game of whack-a-mole, constantly dealing with each thing that's popping up. And that's exhausting. That's taking a good amount of your time, a good amount of your cognitive energy. You have very little energy or time to backfill. Your bucket's getting emptier and emptier. The way that we fill the bucket as humans is through connection. We fill it through friendships. We fill it through experiencing success, experiencing awe, experiencing love, all of these things. And Jack's death occurred during COVID, which was an additional stressor that I don't think that I can't even quantify in terms of how it impacted learners. But you start to have a sense of isolation. If you have interpersonal issues going on, that's another thing that starts to kind of unravel. If you are stressed about deadlines, or in Jack's case, about getting documentation completely redone, right? Let's do a whole new series of tests and assessments to talk about deficits so that you can have access to what you need for this exam. That's not fun for anyone to go through. And the exam itself is a stressful situation applying for accommodations. So you have all of these stressors going on at the same time that you have, John, as you said, you have these disabilities that are working together in an exponential manner. And then you add a layer of a system that is sending covert messages that you should not seek help in this space. It is not safe. Everyone that is there in a function of helping you is somehow tied to the institution. And if you seek help, it will be known, and you may be viewed as less capable or less competent. And this is especially problematic when a learner is looking to go into a competitive specialty, as Jack was. And so I know that there was messaging around, you need to have this many publications, you need to honors and this, and you need to have this score on your exam. And these messages that are coming from what is perceived as a reliable source of information, the most reliable source of information, the people in the system that will support you or not support you in that next step. And when you're depressed or when you're anxious, your brain lies to you, doesn't it? It tells you stories. It is not functioning in the way that it should be functioning. So at the time that you need emotional and cognitive strength, that is also being challenged. We should be working to change the environment to the extent that we are not continuing to stress the learner, but that also the environment is a safe one in which the learner can access resources, access therapy, and feel safe in doing so, and feel like that experience isn't going to get back to people who may then have some bias towards that learner if they were aware.
And we talk about modeling behavior. And so with all that you mentioned, which is spot on, and the depleted self-compassion and all those things that you're dealing with. And as you look to your environment, if you don't see others who sort of share their own experiences and kind of normalize some of these things that are putting such pressure on you, and you only see perfection, and you only see the expectation of perfection, and stay in line and be resilient and step back in, and it just sucks the oxygen out of one's system.
There needs to be a way to implement stress reduction training and teach coping skills. They need to build up the emotional strength. It shouldn't just be an extra chapter. It needs to be embedded into the curriculum. The stress doesn't go away in a medical environment. That's part of it.
Going back to kind of our first meeting, John, you were resolved at that point. You wanted a curriculum and you wanted it threaded throughout medical education. And you wanted people talking about mental health, how to sustain mental health, what to do if you're not feeling well, if you're experiencing certain symptoms. And throughout the series, we talked to several experts. In one episode, Dr. Gold talked about the first time she had a patient die, and the expectation was suck it up, right? Let's move on. We've got to go to the next patient. And that's a teachable moment to be able to stop and have a conversation about death and talk about it and process it as a team. Many schools have started doing that, but it wasn't something that was historically done.
A perfect example of that is when Jack was working one of his rotations, and he was seeing a patient who had attempted suicide. Jack had this patient and dealt with this patient, and there was no discussion with him afterwards about this particular traumatic situation. And, at that time, I think he was 23 years old.
Yeah. I was just thinking the same thing. How does a 22, 23-year-old process that?
Right. Because they don't talk about it in the learning process, or if they do, it's minuscule.
But that's so dangerous.
Yes.
This episode is called Reflections. We're reflecting on the series and the development of the series and what we want to see happen as a result of it. One of the things that I loved, and John, this was something that came directly from a conversation we had early on, was this idea of challenging people that have a construct of what mental health struggling looks like. I mean, Jack's nickname was Happy Jack, and Jack was the life and the light for so many people. And that became obvious when we started, interviewing people, that he was the person that people would go to, right? He seemed to never be struggling. And I think it's easy for us to assume as educators, as researchers, as people in medical education, that when someone is excelling academically, and Jack was beyond excelling academically, or appears to be happy, that these two things aren't always predictive of what's actually happening inside. And we had talked about a social media campaign that Dr. Bullock had shared with us, that was called "This is what suicidality looks like." And it featured videos of people laughing and smiling, and they looked happy and carefree. These videos were taken just days before they wound up passing away. And I remember how powerful that was for me. We've all been conditioned, even in movies and television, that if someone is depressed, they stop bathing, they isolate, they stop functioning, their daily tasks aren't happening, they sleep more, they sleep less. Like, we have all these signs, and those are true. But what we find in medical students is they're really good at faking it. Like, really, really good at faking it. And they often maintain a remarkable level of functionality despite internally not functioning well. And this makes the struggles harder to detect. And I think it also resonates when people are so shocked in the community at the loss of a particular person because no one saw this coming. But in this series, we tried to recognize this dual reality. Then I think we talked about how you can be depressed and be joyful, and those two things can exist simultaneously, which, we want to recognize and we want people to understand. But it is really important that medical educators and people in the medical education system understand the complexity that can also go with that, and then we teach it. And John, I think about episode 4, because I remember at the beginning I was like, there's no time in the curriculum. This is the pushback that's going to happen. And now I am a absolute co-signer that we need to be talking about this across the curriculum into residency training. People need to understand how to recognize signs and symptoms, and that they're not always outwardly apparent. We need to teach people anti-suicide approaches. Justin offered one in one episode that he had learned, and I thought it was so vulnerable of him to share. But it's something we can teach people. We can teach people skills when you're in that moment and your brain is swirling and you're thinking about all these things. What are the things that disrupt those thoughts and move you to a position of help seeking?
The term break the chain.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's so powerful. And there's so much depth and meaning to what you just went through. I think, the first point that you brought up is that oftentimes we're taught to look for signs of somebody who is down and depressed and so forth. But, what we've seen and a lot of what we talked about is this environment causes people to suppress those, what otherwise would be an outwardly visible dimension of their life. They're to normalize just being on top of things.
They have to show themselves to be happy and well.
Absolutely. And so the very system that should be carefully aware of risk is at the same time causing people to bury the signs of risk. And it's just tragic when you think of it. You are rewarded and you are expected to act a certain way, and that's positive. And so, yes, you can see somebody that you would say, gosh, they're just dealing with it. They're excelling. when in fact that's not the case.
Yeah.
And I think with Jack, there's a little bit of a different dimension because, as you said, it was his nickname, Happy Jack, since a little kid. And that's who he was. And we talked about and how much we admire his courage and his strength because he did deal with all these things. And he developed an ability to overcome them, to put them to the side, to focus, to have tools. So they were there, but Jack's natural instinct was to be giving. He was so compassionate and he was hilarious. He was so funny. And, but at a certain point, that pressure builds up and that natural instinct just becomes overpowered. And the surprise comes when all of a sudden an individual's lost and everybody says, I had no idea.
The learners, they just see so much during their educational years, and these students, they create a tolerance for the distress, the anxiety and worry, and they become dysregulated. They're so used to being under this pressure that they start to believe that that's how they're supposed to feel. So this dysregulation is now normal. And when that cumulative exposure is gone, when it's gone, just all of the sudden, everything they've been suppressing comes to the top, and it can be absolutely crushing. They're so dysregulated by the time they get out of their schooling, residency, and then go on.
Dr. Gold does a very good job, I think, in her segment of talking about you just look around, and if the normal is dealing with this toxic environment and keeping a sort of normal persona, if that's normal and you can't do it, then you must be abnormal. I think was kind of paraphrasing what she said. And that's so true. And I would like to go back just real quickly to the curriculum. And I think if there is one thing that could be done, and maybe we'll talk about this, that is truly embedding these tools and these topics into what is fundamentally part of med school's mission. And I think of the ability to see and experience open dialogue around mental health and to see it modeled by teachers and administrators and others. It's so important to give those tools and to set that tone for students.
It's one of the things that was so interesting. When we first met, we were just introduced by someone from another institution, a mutual colleague, a friend to you and your family. I am forever grateful for that introduction. And we didn't meet with any goal in mind. This person just had the forethought to think these two people should meet and something good will come from this meeting. And we spent about a year getting to know each other before we decided what we would do. And one of the things that was so interesting was that I didn't realize, it never occurred to me that the voice missing on this topic was that of the family, that of the parents. I think, the family are often excluded from the broader conversation of medical education reform or of suicide or suicidality in medicine. And so one of the things I love about this series is that we've elevated the voice of the family. And that's also something that I think is powerful in changing hearts and minds. We always talk about if you're going to get people to make change, you have to speak to their mind, right? These are the statistics that we show, the loss of physicians over the continuum, people choosing not to enter medicine. This is the data-driven things, but you also have to speak to their hearts. And these are the stories, and those stories, I think sometimes of the loss of people become statistical stories, right? So they're only speaking to the mind. But when you bring the family into the conversation and we get to know Jack in the way that we got to know him, I think that changes the game. And this is one other reason why I think your article in JAMA Internal Medicine is so important for the medical education community, because I think that voice of the family, the voice of the parents has been lost for so long. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if I might be able to convince you to read just an excerpt from your paper, since this episode will come out after your paper has come out to the world, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
I think the voice of a family makes quite a bit of difference because a lot of the parents are not clinicians. They're not from the medical field. And we are offering a fresh and open and very different perspective of what is going on and what our son or our daughter may be going through. And I guess, we as parents, we were not aware of the vigilance required to send our son into the medical field. We had no idea. And had we known, we would have been a lot more interactive.
If we can somehow inspire or help educate parents, I think that's so important, to your point, and to Jennifer's point, just being aware of what the conditions may be and the expectations may be, and more specifically, be aware of the differences between different medical education institutions. Mm-hmm. Inquire, how important, how do you deal with this? How open is the dialogue? Right. What are your moral standards? What are your key objectives in educating students? And so I think that's so important. But if we look at the dialogue and the research studies and the statistics that have been out there, as we've commented on multiple times in these episodes, that have not really ultimately led to meaningful change. It just seems to us that those conferences and the research papers and the journals are effectively the profession talking to the profession. It's this sort of internal circular knowledge communication loop that has not produced any meaningful change. Honestly, it has not. If you go back and look at how long this has been out there, you look at currently the dialogue, there is no meaningful change. And one of the things that we hope to do is to illustrate and proclaim from outside the profession as parents, and particularly as parents who have lost a child to suicide, that this circular, ongoing internal dialogue within the profession with medical educators just can't be the solution. And so I think if we can call attention to that and sort of break the insular dialogue, and parents can be involved in that, mm-hmm. then maybe we can jar something loose and draw attention and sow the seeds of real change.
Wonderful. How do you feel about sharing part of your call to action?
I'd be happy to share. It is entitled A Call for Mental Health Reform in Medical Education, Breaking the Silence. We know in our hearts that Jack did not want or expect to die. Suicide is often an impulsive act. In a moment when multiple stressors converged and exceeded his threshold, Jack's mind was fooled into believing that there were no other options. He needed his pain to end. We were left devastated and in shock. In the depths of our grief, we saw answers. It has become clear that a cultural and systemic shift is urgently needed. Medical training is inherently challenging, but need not be toxic. Encouraging peer support and maintaining a vigilant awareness of student and colleague well-being are essential cultural changes. With some exceptions, medical institutions and the profession have been tragically slow to enact necessary changes to protect their own. Despite a collaborative aim to address these issues, medical student suicide is medicine's darkest secret. Without data to track progress or failings, when institutions prioritize reputation and liability over open dialogue, they dishonor those lost and neglect the well-being of current and future students.
Beautiful. And I can't wait for the listener to read the full article. And it's not often that an article elicits an invited commentary. That usually suggests that the article is going to be very impactful or talked about. And this article did have an invited commentary. And so we'll look forward to reading that as well. You, as we've gone through this time together and as we went through the episodes, there were recommendations from each expert on what change needs to occur in medical school. That was the focus of an entire episode of the series. Let's say a year from now, it is January 19th, 2025. So to date time stamp, on January 19th, 2026, what change could have happened that you would consider success or successful action to create more supportive environments?
I would like to see the encouragement of peer support and more professional closeness, as it's very impactful and important that they look after each other. And I would say that in addition to accreditation standards, there is a moral and ethical imperative for medical schools to address student well-being.
Absolutely. And I think that we've talked about this in a couple of other areas as well. And I think it's acknowledged by the experts that we had and has to be acknowledged by leaders in the medical schools that two things should happen that are tangible and that can happen in the next year. One of those is the adoption and the implementation of the handbook that we talked about. It was so shocking for us to see that this incredible, thoughtful resource, which had been put together in response to the loss by suicide, that has been out there for a few years, certainly preceding our loss of Jack, that schools, including Jack's school, apparently just weren't aware of or chose not to implement. That just has to happen. This is a tool that's out there and it just needs to be implemented. And there is no excuse if a year from now that it is not implemented. The second would be, as we talked about, is we need to fully integrate these topics into the curriculum. So fundamental change would be illustrated by determining how to embed this into what's taught and to what's discussed in the classroom every day. There is no other marker, there's no other indication of a commitment other than doing that. There's no doubt it's the right thing. And this is important. I think it's just whether or not there's the resolve and the maturity, frankly, of leadership to make the decision to finally put these things into the curriculum and to cause the study and to cause the discussion of mental wellness. What's involved, suicide risk, self-care, and all of these things. And I think that speaks volumes as we look to a year from now to see if institutions, in fact, are committed and understand that, such that they can actually integrate this, begin to integrate this into the curriculum. And I think that will be very telling.
And without practice, true integration or implementation, and the enforcement of these ideas or policies is just another line in the book.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being the first school to create a curricular thread on well-being, awareness, cognitive behavioral strategies for disrupting like depressive thoughts, suicidal thoughts? This will never replace the need for individuals to engage in therapy that's specific and tailored to them,
Mm-hmm.
but to address it universally with all of your learners. That alone, the commitment to that alone would send a message about the culture that you're trying to create. I think the first school that does that will be pleasantly surprised at the return on investment.
Think of how these learners then will be able to help their patients.
Mhm.
They'll have so many more skills.
Through storytelling, honoring the memories of those we've lost, and relentless advocacy, families like the Ruddells bring critical issues to light. Their efforts foster conversations and actions that hold the potential to create meaningful change and prevent future tragedies. In this next section, Dr. Lisa Meeks reflects on an unexpected and deeply emotional moment that shaped the final episode of this series. She shares how the decision to pause was made after another trainee's tragic death captured national attention. The striking parallels between the stories resonated deeply, not only with the Ruddells, but with a broader call to action in medical education. Lisa offers a candid look at how this moment influenced the series, allowing space for reflection, dialogue, and respect for a grieving family, while underscoring the urgency of addressing the systemic issues at the heart of these tragedies.
Well, some listeners may wonder, they may be thinking, okay, wait a second, what's happened? There was an episode October 1st, and we don't get the last episode, episode 6, this episode, until January. What happened? Because, throughout the series, we're talking about all the episodes, and they were being dispersed at pretty regular times. Just to contextualize the gap, I woke up one morning to a number of text messages, a number of emails about an article that hit the front pages of the Washington Post. And, some things happen and you never forget where you are in that moment. And I remember the hour in between kind of reading all of this, going and reading the Post, communicating with some people in medical education, and making the decision that I needed to call you because there had been another loss of a trainee, and that trainee had an uncanny resemblance to Jack, both in physical appearance and in the story that the family was telling. And it's very unusual for a family to tell a story. So it was also paralleling in many ways our objective of telling the story. And I wanted you to hear it from me first because I knew it would get to you. I knew if I was waking up to all of this, that your friends, your family would see this. And I wanted you to be prepared because it was a little, not a little, it was very unsettling. We made a decision together to delay the final episode because we wanted to allow space for that family, and we wanted to allow space for conversations to happen around this article. It was also our way of respecting the family. One other thing about that story that we all felt was really important is that they had interviewed lots of other learners, and what was being said was so catastrophic that it was important that people pay attention to that. So we took a pause, we elevated that story, and I also wanted to give you time to to take that in and to think about it and
Mhm.
to process it. And now in our reflection episode, I'm wondering how you felt when you heard about this.
Mhm.
Did it resonate with you in any particular way? What was critical about that particular
Oh
article?
gosh, Lisa, it was such a heartbreak to read the article. It was, my heart breaks for the family's loss. The article was so beautifully written and so descriptive of this young man. And it just drew, as you said, so many parallels to our son Jack. It just made me more resolute, though, to bring forward this type of information. And I personally respect and so appreciate the family for allowing this article to be published and circulated because their son's life matters. And people need to know and understand that this happens.
What struck me, and I think this is a very important point that it illustrates, is that the young man not only expressed his concern for what he was going through, but his concern for his classmates.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the toxicity of what he perceived, but it was warning of the others who were at risk. And that was such a powerful message. Mm-hmm. And it was done in his words. As we've talked about in our own situation, I believe it was Roja who talked about a gathering of Jack's friends. And she described that among that group, just wonderful, high functioning, very committed group of individuals, that there was a very alarming number who had expressed that they had suicide ideation at some point during school. And so I think the article did a very good job at making a public statement that these are not one-off tragic losses, that every loss, whether it's Jack or that other young man, as tragic as those are, it's also a signal for the others who are dealing with the same thing, who are at great risk. And it's a call to action to try to prevent the others from falling into the same fate. And so I think that messaging was so powerful and on point, and I think, frankly, very consistent with what our objective is, which is to say that there's a lot of suicide statistics, but beneath those, there are a lot who are at very high risk of suicide.
Jesse Gold had talked about how when someone loses their life to suicide and no one talks about it, the school acts as if it never happened. No one talks about it. There's no acknowledgement that the death was a suicide. It is incredibly harmful to the learners that are left behind, the friends, the family.
Because they know.
They know.
Yeah.
And no one talks about it, so there's no opportunity to process it. There's no opportunity to teach. There's no opportunity to really engage in a very real conversation about this topic. Everything is abstract. It's 400 physicians a year. It's little bits and pieces, and it isn't the true story. It's been a journey. I mean, almost 3.5 years to do this. And it has been an experience where I've learned and been challenged in what I believed was possible. And I know I'm very grateful for you and for you sharing this story. I know that our audiences, I have shared with you learners that have reached out and thanked us for having this very bold conversation. And of course, we're immensely grateful to all of the experts who quickly and willingly signed on to address this topic with us, trusted us in the production of the materials. And I believe every one of them is very proud to have been part of this series. And I know all of them are very grateful for you. This series would not be possible without you. And it takes a lot of strength to do this. And I just will be forever grateful. And I know this isn't the end of our relationship, because we will, for those of you who follow the podcast and who follow our work, we have our dream grand rounds, and we will have a Jack Ruddell grand rounds that's dedicated to talking about mental health, suicidality, and how to improve the conditions of medical education that will happen each year in honor of Jack.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for helping us create something out of that first meeting that you mentioned, which we really no visibility of what would come of it, and couldn't, I think at the time, even imagine how it has blossomed into something so meaningful and hopefully impactful. And so we are very appreciative of your personal emotional investment in Jack and in this topic.
And your guidance and your help in helping us advocate for change in a positive way. You've helped us to honor our son, and I am forever grateful for that.
As we bring this episode and this series to a close, we hope Jack's story serves as a lasting catalyst for change. Through the voices of our experts and the heartfelt reflections of the Ruddells, we've gained a deeper understanding of the immense challenges medical students face and the potential devastating consequences. To create meaningful change, we must destigmatize mental health, foster supportive and inclusive learning environments, and implement evidence-based strategies to safeguard student well-being. Medical schools have a critical role to play in prioritizing the mental health of their learners. Let Jack's memory and the stories of countless others inspire us to take action. By advocating for systemic change, raising awareness, and providing compassionate support, we can help ensure that every medical student has the opportunity to thrive, academically, personally, and emotionally. Together, we can build a future where well-being is not just an ideal, but a fundamental part of medical education.